Rejected by Damascus and being studied by Russia, the Arab League proposal to deploy peacekeepers in Syria is gathering momentum. But could this proposal work on the ground, and would Moscow and Beijing soften their positions in the United Nations? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Syria has rejected a call by the Arab League for a joint UN peacekeeping force to be stationed in the country. The idea was proposed during a meeting of the group's foreign ministers on Sunday in Cairo. For it to happen, the UN Security Council would have to agree, and it was the Council that failed to pass a resolution recently for action against Syria when Russia and China vetoed the draft. Beijing will not yet be drawn on the matter of peacekeeping troops, while Moscow says it is studying the plan, adding there would have to be a ceasefire first.
We have joint efforts to support the Syrian people in its aspirations and hopes for a better life, democratic development. We have the joint effort, this aspiration to, as soon as possible, to stop this bloodshed. For this reason, we need a wide inter-Syrian dialogue and cooperation to find solution of decisions which will meet the interests of all Syrians and which will rule out interference from outside.
Well, as we mentioned, the Arab League met in Cairo on Sunday to decide on action against Syria. Let's take a listen to what the Arab League Secretary General had to say on the matter.
Achieving our goal of ending bloodshed in Syria requires us to reconsider presenting the matter to the Security Council. This must be done in consultation and coordination with all the concerned sides, particularly Russia and China, in order to have a resolution passed with urgency by the Security Council, compelling all the parties involved to fulfill specific obligations.
So the question poses, could the international community agree on a new proposal on Syria this time around? And to take this on, I'm joined by our three guests. From London, Ammar Wakaf, a member of the Syrian Social Club, a pro-government group supporting reform. Also from London, we have Nabila Ramdani, Middle East analyst and columnist. And joining us from Moscow, Sergei Strokhan, political analyst and columnist for the Kommersant, Russia's daily news online. And Sergei, if we could start with you, Sergei Strokhan in Moscow. Russia and China, it seems, are considering the concept of a joint peacekeeping force. What might, do you think, persuade them that this could be a good way forward?
Well, the first reaction from the Russian side came from today's statement made by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who said that we are still examining the proposal of our Arab League partners. So he refrained from making any resolute statement whether Russia will support it or not. But at the same time, he hinted that Russia can support this idea if two basic conditions are met. The first condition is that peace should be established in Syria, and it is too premature to send peacekeepers if there's no peace. And the second point is that the idea should be supported by President Assad. So it's a very interesting situation. It looks as if Russia said polite yes. But in reality, it seems that this polite yes means no, because, as you said, President Assad has already rejected the idea. And in addition to that, it is too idealistic, too naive to believe that first peace will be established and then some peacekeepers would come to preserve it.
OK, well, let's take those 2 points on. And Nabila Ramdani, if I can take this to you in London. The problem is there is absolutely no peace to keep right now, and that is the very first and major obstacle to overcome.
Well, very much so. And the fact that Russia has called today for a ceasefire before a UN Arab peace peacekeeping mission could be deployed in Syria to stop the violence says everything about the intransigence of the international community. What effectively Russia is saying is it wants to stop the fighting before peacekeepers could go in and stop the fighting. And I would argue that this is exactly the kind of cynical politicking that President Assad would want, because he's precisely playing on divisions and the lack of action from the international community to carry on not only eradicating any form of armed insurgency, but also very much aware that civilian populations are being killed in the wake of his crackdown.
But I mean, Russia's saying that a ceasefire is needed first. The British Foreign Secretary said much the same thing. It is absolutely right that you've got to have peacekeeping troops keeping a peace. So, you know, it doesn't sound like any kind of conspiracy as such. It's just a bare fact, isn't it, Nabila?
The reality is that it would prove extremely difficult to get peacekeeping forces on the ground, because President Assad will see it as a declaration of war, as a breach to the sovereignty of his country, and he would certainly attack. One thing he wouldn't want as well is to allow for a truce to happen, which will effectively allow the Free Syria Army and insurgent groups to grow stronger and therefore weaken his position within the country.
Amar Wakaf, what do you make of all this? Amar Wakaf from the Syrian Social Club. What are your thoughts? Do you see that there's a glimmer of opportunity here, or is this just another hopeless cause?
I think we need to understand the basic motives of the international community. I think the western part of the international community is pretty much occupied with, in a sort of toppling the government rather than making Syria more stable. The eastern part, the Russias and the Chinas of the world, are perhaps more interested in having the better solution out of this, with disregard whether the current government in Syria stays or leaves, really. The Arabic part of the international community have pulled themselves into this game of bet all and lose all, so that they're quite desperate to get rid of the Syrian government. With regards to this specific proposal of the Arab League, I think the Syrian government, just like Madame Ramdani said, I think the Syrian government would view this as a sort of sovereignty issue and wouldn't want them to come in, A, and B, part of the way the Syrian government looks at things, I believe, is that there is much hope being given to the insurgency on the ground to keep it lasting for as much as or as long as possible, and they might not view this final or latest development any differently, really. So they would want to control things on the ground before they would want to discuss anything with the outside world with regards to who gets in or who gets out.
I take your point. You know, certainly the peacekeeping mission may be dead in the water, as it were. But Amar, isn't there a window of opportunity here? A small window, albeit, but isn't it a window of opportunity to try and fashion at least a ceasefire?
Well, that would be great if it is brokered in a constructive way. In a sense, instead of saying, you know, the Syrian government are the bad guys and the insurgency are the good guys, what the international community could actually do is to say, well, okay, we have two forces on the ground, let's try to mediate, exactly as Russia is doing, actually. And if that could be brokered, then that would be a basis where Syria could go into a step forward, really, in this political issue and say, well, okay, well, we've put bloodshed behind our backs, let's see whether we can turn this into a viable political process, really. I think there is a slight window of opportunity, but the way the international West is, the international community, the western part of the international community is going about this, I don't think it's going to happen, unfortunately.
So let's put this to Sergei Stroka. You said that a possible yes from Sergei Lavrov actually meant no, but in a sense that was potentially a slight softening of his stance. Could we see a softening in their tone and that of China when it comes to the United Nations?
Well, I hope you will agree that all of us want to establish peace in Syria. But the basic difference comes when we think over how we have to achieve peace. And this is the situation when we are witnessing a growing gap in understanding of the situation in Syria, how it is seen in Moscow and in Beijing on one hand, and in Western capitals on the other hand. I think that if the proposal is put to the United Nations Security Council, then most obviously will experience another sense of déjà vu, and Russia and China would use their veto right the way how they have done it last October and a week back. The basic misunderstanding is over the very role of peacekeepers. Of course, as I said, everybody wants peace to be established in Syria, but Russia's leadership and Russia's political elite, as I understand it, feel deep suspicion towards the real intention of those who are coming forward with this resolution. They believe that they have hidden agenda and that the real motivation is not to establish peace, but to overthrow legitimate government. And final thing Moscow is making emphasis on is that apart from military warfare, we are seeing we've seen an escalating information war over Syria. And part and parcel of this misinformation is the notion that President Assad is no more popular, whereas Russia is referring to its sources, which say that still more than a half of the population of Syria supports President Assad. This is unpleasant news to those who have already written him off, but this is the reality.
Okay, let me bring in Nabila. I've got to pass it around, Sergei. Nabila Ramdani, what are your thoughts that if this does go to the UN Security Council, do you think it's got any hope of any progress?
Well, I think Russia has made it abundantly clear that it wants, a peacekeeping force on al-Assad's terms, which means that they want to keep al-Assad in power and have peace on his own terms. Now, there are very good reasons for Russia to behave that way. Of course, they have geostrategic interests in the region. They have been an ally of Syria since the Soviet times, and they are, trade partners and political partners. But I think more crucially, the reason why Russia is effectively, which is a UN member, and effectively is taking sides in all this, saying that the problem in Syria really is the armed groups that are challenging the Syrian regime. The reason for Russia to take sides is because the Russians are still very much rattled, if I may put it that way, by the mission creep following the UN resolution 1973 over Libya, which effectively went from the protection of civilian lives to regime change, and that's precisely what the Russians would like to avoid at any costs in Syria.
Well, it sounds perfectly reasonable that regime change is avoided, isn't it?
Well, the problem is for Syria and for the Syrian regime, it's an attack on its sovereignty. And if you look at the situation, there is no, President Assad is still confident that he can, win over the situation. He's trying to regain control over rebel-held areas, and he's determined to eradicate any form of armed insurgency. He is being equipped by Russian weaponry. His army hasn't, we haven't seen, major defections at all within the Syrian army. The merchant classes are still very much behind the Syrian president. So there's no, for him, the situation can be won over.
All right, I'll put that to Sergei. Russia's vested interests are too strong for them to be compliant to this kind of resolution. What do you think about that?
Well, there's a lot of talk that the basic notion between Russia's no to the draft resolution is that Russia will lose its one of the key partners in the Middle East. And partly it is true because if President Assad is ousted from power, then Russia will find itself in an extremely unpleasant situation, losing its door to the Middle East. But what is at stake today is not only Russia's military and technical cooperation, political cooperation with its partner, but what is at stake is the very mechanism of settling crisis like that. You mentioned Libya, and one of Russia's reservations is that Russia was very much infuriated over the way how the United Nations Security Council resolution on Libya was mishandled, used to overthrow the government of Colonel Gaddafi. So Russia wants it to be not repeated anymore. And in addition to that, Russian analysts here say that while there are a lot of similarities between Gaddafi and Assad, Syria is not Libya, in a sense that Syria is not isolated, unlike it was with Gaddafi. Syria still enjoys the support from Iran. It still supports support from Hezbollah, which, by the way, influences the moderate position of Lebanon. Syria still has support of Russia and China. So a Russian official position is that it is too early to write President Bashar off.
Okay, let me take this to Amar Wakaf. Sergei Strokan then saying in Moscow that Syria is not isolated. It still has the support of half its people. What do you say about that?
Well, I certainly agree. I think the support that the government currently has is basically the reason why we haven't seen any defections or major defections either from the army or from the state itself. The state itself is still intact. Yes, it's been
we haven't seen any major defections.
There's
continual defections every single day. We see more and more defections from the army. That's just absolutely not true.
Well, let's just compare that to what happened in Egypt, what happened in Libya, and what happened in Yemen and Tunisia. We've seen ambassadors defecting, we've seen major army officers saying, no, we don't want this, and so on and so forth. But actually, I've been in Syria in the past. I've only came in the festive period. And the state is still functioning there. You still have people on the street, putting water to the palm trees on the Mezzi Autostrad, for example. The state is still functioning, basically. And the reason why is this happening is that the majority of Syrians do not want the change that is being promoted in the outside. Now, it's all fine that Syria has this international support from Russia, from China, from Lebanon, from Iran, from Iraq, and so on and so forth. But what is important actually inside Syria is the support that the government has from the Syrian people, who are not interested in any change, are not interested in something that being imposed on them without any real alternative. The real alternative that they keep hearing about is human rights, democracy, all these ambiguous terms. But what exactly is going to happen, we don't know. There is also a major issue, which is a question of identity. Do we want the Syrians to become identified by their religion, as some part of the revolution suggests, or do we want to keep a secular society? There are huge questions that are being asked in Syria that are not conveyed to the outside world, but they are the reason why a large proportion of Syrians still support the current government, instead of any alternative they're not so sure about.
So Nabila Ramdani, do you buy into that? The majority of Syrians do not want change?
Well, there is certainly Syria will be a tougher nut to crack than Libya, for all the reasons that the two guests have highlighted. First of all, the internationalization of the conflict is far too great. There's of course the Tehran-Damascus axis. There's support from militant groups like Hezbollah. Syria is very much backed up, as we've said, by Russia and indeed China. All these countries will effectively are put against NATO and Israel, and the escalation of a wider regional conflicts are far too great. And also, I think the deterioration of the situation in Syria is due to external powers using the influence in Syria. And as our Syrian guest highlighted, you add to that the fact that the Syrian society is made up of a very complicated mix itself, and it makes the situation in the country much more difficult to sort out.
Can you simplify it to the degree that could you actually say that the majority of Syrian people do not want change, as Amar Wakaf just said?
I think that the escalation in the rhetoric from the international community, and certainly among Arab League countries, is giving more confidence to an armed opposition to organize itself better. And there are also claims that the Free Syrian Army is already being armed by supportive countries. And let's remember that a few weeks ago, Belhaj, who's the commander the commander of Tripoli in Libya has himself traveled to Turkey to interact with the Free Syrian Army. So I think certainly President Assad feels emboldened by the Russian and Chinese vetoes not to intervene in any way in Syria. But equally, the Free Syrian Army and an increasing section of the Syrian population is determined to catch the moment to try and overthrow Assad.
Ammar, back to you.
Yeah, let me give you a sort of sneak peek into the minds of an ordinary Syrian. All Syrians won't change, that's for sure. Now, how to conduct this change is the issue that has been laid on to the public in Syria from day one. Now, do we topple the regime as it is, or do we stick with it because we do not have a better alternative? And actually, the alternative we're having now is far worse, and it would lead to, probably in the extreme case, to the disintegration of the country itself. So all of us, we do need change. How to come about doing it is thought by the majority of Syrians, and I think this notion of majority of Syrians was sort of proved by a Qatar Foundation funded opinion poll that was carried out by YouGov Siraj, and found out that 55% of the people polled from inside Syria do not want President Assad to go. And that tells you that Syrians, apart from whether they like change or not, obviously everybody wants to have change, they do not want the toppling of the regime because they fear of what might come next. So all of us want change, and we because the President Assad still has some popularity, and because he's still young, and a lot of us believe that actually he's tried to do something, but perhaps the regime itself is too rigid to go farther and faster than we would have probably wanted. We still believe in his capability. That's why we still want him rather than anybody else, at least for the time being.
Nabila, I find it quite curious today that we saw Sheikh Abdullah of the UAE, which is of course a GCC state, sitting alongside the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Do you think that the Gulf states are here in a position trying to offer a kind of political and economic way through this?
Well, they've certainly made it clear in yesterday's meeting in Cairo, especially the Gulf countries, that they would support politically and militarily the Syrian opposition. They haven't clarified their position about arming the Free Syrian Army, which will inevitably lead to accusations of a break in international law, of course, and probably lead to an escalation of the killing, the violence, in fact, on the ground. But I think there's the reason, and I think Syrian guest is right when he says that, yes, Syrians would like to see change in Syria, but they're also afraid of what's coming next. And especially there are fears that a Sunni-dominated Syria would lead to perhaps an ill treatment of other minorities, and that's precisely why we are seeing President Assad targeting Sunni-dominated cities in particular.
Okay, Sergei Strokan, lastly I'll come to you. The thing is, we're all talking here as if there's all the time in the world, and Russia and China especially are talking as if there's all the time in the world, and there isn't. House-to-house raids, mass arrests, mass killings. There just isn't time for this talking, is there? And things aren't going to change on the streets of Syria right now.
Mass killings, this is part of Syrian realities, and believe me, Russian side by no means wants to be an advocate of President Assad. And President Medvedev more than once sent messages to President Assad pledging to stop violence immediately, to stop crackdown on opposition. But I think that our today's discussion, judging by what we have already said, reveals that Syrian people and the life of Syrian people and the future of Syrian people today has turned into a hostage to the geopolitical game, when major world and regional powers having their own agenda over Syria. Iran has its own agenda, Saudi Arabia and Gulf states have their own, United States have their own, and so does Russia, along with China.
We'll have to leave it there.
So
a hostage to geopolitical games. I'm sorry, Sergei, we've run out of time. A hostage to geopolitical games is how it seems to be. Amar Wakaf and Nabila Ramdani, and from Moscow, Sergei Strokan. Thanks for your time, and thanks for watching this edition of Inside Story. If you want to email us your feedback, just send your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. From me, Nick Clark. It's goodbye.